series. Welcome back to Alaska. Great to see
Thank you.
Welcome everybody to webinar number 2 in our Alaska Staff Development Network series, The Other Side of the Report Card, Supporting Social and Emotional Learning in Your Classroom, School, and District. We won't do a big introduction tonight because we did that for webinar number 1, but we're just thrilled to have Maurice, one of the nation's leading experts and a longtime scholar and practitioner in the field of social emotional learning and character development, back with us for number 2 webinar in our 6-part series. Tonight, the topic is best practices in social emotional learning program implementation, leadership, infrastructure, support, capacity building, and assessment. Before we turn things over to Maurice, I want to mention that Diana Kirka will come on at the end of the webinar. And Diana is the credit course instructor. I know many of you have enrolled in the credit course that's tied in with these webinars. I'm at SeaTac Airport tonight on my way back to Juneau, but I should be with you up until about 5:15 Alaska time, 6:15 Seattle time, when I have to get on my flight back to Juneau. So, and of course, I want to thank Melissa Crane, our very able technical support person, for all her help in making these webinars flow so nicely. So welcome aboard, Maurice.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back, and I confess that's probably just as well that I'm in New Jersey, where we are enjoying very odd weather here. We expect to have it to be 70 degrees by Thursday. So one never knows what one is going to get. I am excited to be able to share with you some literally work that we've been doing for 40 years in the schools in New Jersey and around the country and literally around the world, focusing on the topic of implementation. I tell you, this is one of the things that I learned a number of years ago when we did a study in New Jersey of all social and emotional learning programs. And what we found was that if you looked at the ledger saying which programs succeeded and which programs didn't succeed, you would find on the success side, Second Step, Open Circle, Social Decision Making, Ruler, Paths, you name it, the big name programs are on that success side. And when you go over to the failure side, you would find Second Step, Open Circle, Social Decision Making, Path. You'd find the exact same list. And so it became very clear that what ultimately determines whether a program succeeds or not is not the way it's written, but the way it's carried out. And we've come to understand a lot about program implementation. And those are some of the lessons learned that I want to share with you. In particular, the topic of leadership, infrastructure, the topic of support, capacity building, and assessment. And we will touch upon all these things today, although a couple of them will be touched upon in some of our upcoming workshops as well. So here's the thing that everybody always says. I can actually get my PowerPoint to advance. Here we go. That it takes 3 years. And everybody always says that. And then the question is, well, why does it take 3 years? And I'm interested, if anyone has some reflections that they want to put in the chat box about that, I'm more than happy to take a look and have others see. But it's really fascinating that this insight has proven to be true over and over and over again. It takes 3 years to really implement a program in a meaningful way and have it be likely not to disappear. And so a couple of things, reasons for that are, they're sort of obvious, that habits are hard to change. You know, if you've ever been on a diet of any kind, or you've tried to inculcate some sort of an exercise routine or something like that, however well-meaning you are, it's hard to change our habits from what we used to do. And so if you're in the business of being a teacher, counselor, psychologist, and you've done things the way you've done them, and, here I am, I come along with a wonderful, fabulous, research-based idea. Maybe I was part of the Alaska Professional Development Network, and I saw a great webinar, and I want to go back and tell my colleagues how great it was. Habits are hard to change, and we have to be very respectful of that. And not only that, it's hard to change because even good change is really challenging. And that's partly because it's only the people who have experienced the change that really know how good it's going to be. For the rest of us, it's just a promise. And finally, Seymour Saracen, many years ago, wrote a book called The Culture of the Schools and the Problem of Change. And in that book, among other things, he imagined what it would be like if someone from another planet landed on Earth and started walking around in schools. What would they sort of reflect on? And he said, for example, what they would say, well, why are there bells going off every 42 minutes? And in fact, why is it that people seem to be moving around every 42 minutes for about 5 minutes, and then they kind of settle down, and then they get up again? A lot of things that Saracen tried to reflect on. And one of the things that he reflected on was why it does seem to take 3 years to make a change. And basically, the reasons are these. The first year you try to make a change has to be considered a pilot year. And in fact, when I introduce social emotional learning to schools, I always tell them that we're going to start out with a pilot. I learned this from one of my most valued mentors, Tom Schuyler, who was a principal a number of years ago at a couple of schools that I worked at. And Tom Schuyler said that whenever he introduced an innovation to his staff, he would call it a pilot. If it didn't work, he would say, well, it was only a pilot. If it did work, he would say, well, that was only the pilot. So either way, he was covered by calling something a pilot. And the idea of a pilot is that you want to give folks a chance to just try it out. No pressure. Just try a little bit, just to get comfortable with it. Then the next year is really the first full year that people might be trying something out. And you can reflect on this in your own experience, but certainly my experience has been that if I'm trying something out for the first time over the course of a year, it's not until the end of the first year that I have some idea of what I'm really doing. So now the end of the first full year is really the second year. So then the third year is when you finally know enough to be able to design that 1 year experience in a way that you have influence on and it feels right to you. And so at the end of that third year, you feel, I get it. And that's the 3-year cycle that we can't seem to shake. But Saracen was operating in a time when programs were simpler, when we were just thinking about putting a program in for a year, and that was it. Of course, now we know that getting lasting social and emotional change in kids typically requires more than a year. So we have to think multi-year. And Saracen wasn't worried about multi-tiered systems of support. He wasn't worried about tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 interventions. Didn't have that stuff then. And quite honestly, most of the early social and emotional curricula were not developmental. Some of you may remember, in the old days, you would get a curriculum and it would say social skills training for grades 1 through 3. And, you'd open up the book. And if you're a first grade teacher, you'd pick out a few things. If for the second grade teacher, you'd pick out, use the same book, pick out some things, third grade, same thing. But from the point of view of the kids, they could be getting the same thing every year. And so it's only a relatively recent vintage that we've started to have developmentally sequenced social and emotional learning curricula. And I think that's a very, very important consideration, because how these things build on each other ultimately matters a great deal. So just by way of review of what we talked about last time, even when we talk about social and emotional learning curricula, we're really talking about a complicated set of things. We're talking about having the right kind of climate. We're talking about the right kind of SEL skill instruction. And then we're talking about getting rid of the old habits of mind that we associated with No Child Left Behind, where finding the right answer was so important. Now, in the new era that we're in, it's much more having critical thinking skills, being curious, knowing how to both give and get feedback, not only knowing how to answer questions, but also how to ask questions, how to communicate. So we now understand that you can't disentangle academic, social, and emotional aspects of learning. And so that's why, we have a webinar series, because there are a lot of things we have to cover. And in the workshop coming up on November 13th, there will be emphasis on school culture and climate, both assessment and climate building. That in our workshop on the 4th, we'll talk a lot about specific instruction in SEL techniques. And as I said, today we're focusing more on the broader implementation framework. Again, just by way of review, these are the 5 SEL skills that are identified by the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. These are the 5 skills that form the basis of the SEL curriculum in Anchorage, which was really one of the first well-developed, developmentally sequenced curricula from K to 12. Absolutely fabulous work that was done there that has influenced many, many other places. Again, revolving around these 5 basic skill areas and understanding that these are deceptively simple, but really it's about how we work with our feelings, how we manage our strong emotions, paying particular attention to empathy, because a school and a classroom can't function without empathy. Understanding how to work in groups and teams. And then finally, ethical, constructive, responsible decision-making skills. So these are the 5 areas that are the focus of SEL skill development within that broader frame. And some of you may recall, if you were with us last time, that we shared this jumbled schoolhouse model, reflecting the fact that our schools quite often have many, many good things in them, but they're not necessarily organized synergistically. And so one of our agendas has to be, how do we make sure that we have efforts to build SECD, social and emotional and character in our schools, that we're building academics, and that we never lose sight of the fact that in order to have successful academics, you cannot have kids that are violent, that are alcohol, tobacco, or other drug involved, that are not healthy, involved in premature sexual behavior. In other words, you can't expect kids to learn when they have many other competing difficulties. And quite frankly, that kids are not motivated to learn academic skills just for the sake of academic skills. That their motivation is for service and character. That our children, we should be presuming that all of our children want to grow up to make great contributions to the world and be kids of good character. And if we can let them know that we believe that's true for them, that is their best and biggest motivation to learn academic skills, i.e., give me the skills I need to do something. And the same is absolutely true with social and emotional learning skills. These are the skills that the kids need to do great things in their lives. So I have a few analogies that I like to use, and I will encourage you to use when you talk to people about the stuff with regard to creating sustainable interventions, because that's really the agenda. We want our intervention work to be sustainable. First analogy is that of a quilt. So think about a quilt, and a quilt has a number of different pieces. And so, yet what makes it a quilt? And if you want to put your thoughts in the chat box, that's fine. What makes a quilt, as opposed to just a collection of pieces? If you think a little bit about that, and then think about how much of a quilt one needs to, or how big a quilt one needs before one experiences warmth. So you have a kid, and you want the child to be warm, and the question is, how big a quilt do they need? I mean, it sounds like a silly question, but these two things are related. As many of you said, what holds a quilt together is the way it's stitched together. They're separate pieces, they all have value, but indeed they need to be connected. And social, emotional, and character virtues are very often the connecting thread in what happens in our schools. And what's interesting about that is that even when you have a quilt, how big does it have to be? Another way of thinking about it is, when do we have a supportive, comfortable, warm school environment? And the answer is when people feel that way. There's no prescribed amount of quilting that will guarantee your school environment is going to be a warm, positive, nurturing environment. You simply have to take the temperature of the school and keep adding supportive pieces stitched together until you've accomplished the goal of kids and staff feeling warm and comfortable in the school, right? So that's the quilt. My second analogy is rowing, Olympic rowing. I love to watch Olympic rowing. I may be unique in that, but I do. So what happens in an Olympic, when they're rowing, what happens to the boat if one person decides they're not going to row? They're just not going to row. Everybody's going to row, but one person's not going to row. What happens to the boat? It is unbalanced. Well, what direction does it go in? Can't go straight, right? Goes off course, kind of goes in a circle. Now tell me, what happens if one person on the boat decides that they are going to row faster than everybody else, right? Everybody else is rowing at a steady pace. One person I think I can help the boat go faster by rowing a lot. Exactly the same thing. So implementation is like Olympic rowing. Everybody needs to row together. If somebody decides, if your fourth grade teacher decides that they're going to put their oar out of the water, things are going to go in circles. And if your third grade teacher decides they're going to do twice as much as everybody else, that's not helpful either. In fact, if everybody rows in the way they're all supposed to row, with you calling out the signals, for row, then it goes more smoothly and you go as fast as you can go. So again, we're in an era now where individual choice and decision-making on the part of faculty about whether we're going to implement SEL, can't have it. It's so basic now that we have to be prepared to insist that everybody does it, in the same way that you wouldn't allow someone to not teach math and you wouldn't allow someone to not teach reading. Analogy number 3, relay race. Of Question is, do the 4 fastest runners always win the relay race? They don't. What do you have to do to win the race? Got to cooperate. And what is the form that cooperation takes? You got to hand that baton off, right? And we don't do this very well in education, right? You have to hand off the baton of SEL from grade 1 to grade 2, grade 3 to grade 4, elementary to middle to high school. If we don't do that, we're not likely to win the race. That's the analogy I was using before. That's the problem when your curricula are like multi-grade curricula. Then it's not clear how we're handing off the SEL from grade 1 to grade 2, 2 to grade 3, right? Okay, last analogy. I'm not a science person, but here's a question. What do you call a room that's lit by a circuit that is 99.9% complete? Jeanette was quick on the chat, and others are following suit. It is a dark room, right? And so this is the same thing with SEL. If we don't implement it fully and with integrity, we have a dark room. Our kids are not going to see the light of SEL unless we're willing to, if you will, go the distance and make it an integral part of what we're talking about in their schools, right? So maybe you can get a sense of why I'm so focused on implementation, why I think it's so important, and why you need the tools to talk about it for the people who are not here. They're not on the webinar. When you take the word back, sometimes analogies are much better than research projects. So we kind of know where we have to go. The question is how we're going to get there. At the bottom of the slide, you can see there's a reference to Castle's 5 Keys to SEL video on Edutopia. And I'm going to show you this video because it is the most widely shown and widely viewed video with regard to social and emotional character orientation. So in other words, if you're going to orient someone to social and emotional and character development, you're going to probably want to show people this video. So take a look and see what strikes you as you're watching it.
Social and emotional skills are the essential skills for success in school, work, and life. Social emotional learning centers their mind and body. It reduces their emotional tension so they can be open to new content and material. We find that academic outcomes increase exponentially when students are nurtured, loved, and cared for, that we get much more out of them when we first address social emotional needs. So for us, it's actually an academic intervention and not just an emotional one. If we expect students to be college and career ready, it's important for us to focus on these skills and competencies: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. Self-awareness is the ability to identify your emotions, to be able to tie thoughts and feelings to behaviors. We find that self-awareness is one of the hardest things for young people, being aware of their own body space and the impact of their words and emotions on other people. So a lot of what we do is reflective, through conflict mediation, through circles, through journaling, having them see their own impact on the world, and then how to shift that or make a different choice next time. Self-management is the ability to self-motivate, to have self-control, to regulate one's emotions. In the classroom, that may be a breathing exercise, or that might be counting to 5 or taking a break.
So with students who don't really know how to deal with their anger or don't really know how to resolve conflict, we're giving them a tool that helps them deal with it in a less stressful way.
Social awareness is about embracing diversity, showing empathy for others, Activities might include service learning projects, addressing social justice issues. Role playing is a great life. You may not need calculus tomorrow, but you have to know how to work in relationships, whether it's for a coworker or a life partner. You have to know how to handle conflict and how to handle challenges.
Sometimes at recess, Mommy would come over and just start talking about us and saying mean things.
Is it your job to make Danae's job at school hard?
No, I know it's a form of bullying, and sometimes I'll say sorry to her.
So you choose to be someone's ally and make a better choice. Responsible decision-making is considering the well-being for self and others. It's evaluating the consequences for various behaviors or actions. We do this through shared agreements, one-to-one problem solving, or having students debate an issue.
If you were like, hey, Sheeta, can I, how much does an A cost in this class? And you took out your wallet, and I was like, $50 would work. Which one of us would be corrupt? You're the one that's asking for the money?
We're truly teaching these students to be productive citizens. We're teaching them life skills. We're teaching them how to problem solve effectively. We're teaching them how to be resilient.
I think of all the billions of dollars we've spent on Title I and all these intervention programs, and when all is said and done, what do we have to show for it? I think we're trying to teach technical things instead of devoting some of the resources to teach who you are as a person. Once you know who you are, then learning becomes exciting because you've already established a discipline.
It's important for teachers and principals to understand that it can't be a binder off the shelf. It can't be something that happens from 2:15 to 4:30 on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It has to be part of the school culture. Giving teachers flexibility, giving them a range of skills, giving them different ways that it can look, and allowing them to take their own personality and match that to what they want in their classroom has been the best way to get authentic, true practice.
If we continue to do what we've always done, we're always going to get what we always got. Is that good enough? I don't think it's good enough for the 21st century. We need to be the outliers to try things that have never been tried and see if they work. What are we waiting for?
Okay. So I'm curious as to what you might have found particularly striking about the video. I have to get back to where we were. So I know that, so some of you may know that Edutopia is the website of the George Lucas Education Foundation. I myself, when I heard that George Lucas was going to be making this video, I would confess, I was hoping we were going to see Yoda, maybe a couple of lightsabers, but, they chose to go down a different approach. But I think these are useful things. I think the fact that it has to be part of the culture. I think the closing comments by Josh Garcia about the fact that if we expect we're going to get different results, by doing the same thing we've always done, that makes no sense. And his comment about, what are we waiting for? I think also resonates very, very strongly with me. And the whole idea of how we will be using kids as resources, that's something that will definitely come up a lot in our series. So speaking of resources, if you think about how we get to comprehensive school-wide SECD, there are a few different things that are key elements to think about. Number one is the need to build a school infrastructure that supports SEL. Another thing is to look at how well coordinated your school SEL programs are. That's the jumbling of the schoolhouse. We're going to talk about these two things in a couple moments. Assessing your school culture and climate is something that we will be definitely talking about in a subsequent webinar. And then articulating shared values, themes, and essential life habits, that is linked to SEL assessment, and we'll be covering that today as well. So I have a question for you. I'd like you to think about leadership teams, implementation support teams, or even just committees and work groups that you've been part of, and think of the ones that have been successful. When you think about the teams that you've been on that have really worked, what has been responsible for their success? If you happen to be with a colleague, it's a good conversation to have. If you are by yourself, take a couple of seconds and jot down some of your thoughts about, from your own experience, what has made successful leadership teams, implementation support teams, work groups, task forces that you've been on, what has made them work? And we're seeing some things in the chat box already. You guys are pretty fast in Alaska, I tell you, I'm impressed. Clear goals, shared leadership, buy-in, trust and true collaboration, listening, flexibility, having everybody on board, being respectful, creating a climate and norms of respectfulness, predictable expectations, the communication, both patterns, etc., open-minded. This is great. This is really terrific. I'm clearly with a group of folks that have had excellent experiences in this area. So I want to just review for you a little bit about what the literature talks about, because there are a couple of things here that are very pragmatic that we sometimes neglect. And that first one on our list are just simple things, but is there advance notice about a meeting? Is there an agenda that comes out in advance so that people can actually prepare for the meeting? Are people clear about why they're at the meeting? Do people know their roles and responsibilities on the committee? There are a lot of committees and groups that we're on where people just don't even know why they're there. And when a meeting ends, are there clear action steps and time frames assigned to specific people? And one of the things that we all know is that the success of a committee or a team doesn't depend on what happens at the meeting, but what happens in between meetings. And that's what these very basic structural issues are making sure we don't lose track of. I've certainly been part of a number of groups where those simple things are neglected. Another, some of you have mentioned this, building personal and shared visions. You know, what is this committee about? Where are we headed? Do we all understand where we're going? And do we actually have agreement about the mission, vision, and purpose, with a purpose ideally being spelled correctly, which is not on the slide, for what we're doing? And many of you have talked about the need to create a safe environment, modeling cooperation, cohesion, trust. Reflect, reassess, and improve. How do we monitor what we're doing on the committee? How do we monitor the impact? How do we get feedback from the folks who are supposed to be affected by our work? That's a very critical part of what we do. And are we helping people work in their areas of strength? And are we taking advantage of the strengths of the people who are on our committee? Do we celebrate success? That's something I think that we sometimes can overlook. And I would even go a step further and say that we need to celebrate small success, because hard indeed is it to get the big success. And on the road to that, we need to recognize the small things that we've done, the little changes, the little nuances that begin to create momentum of change. The communication is another piece that I've seen relatively neglected. And by that I mean, honestly, how does the rest of the school community know what this committee is doing? How are we communicating what we're doing? Are we even including the kids in our communication? That's especially for an SEL-related committee, it is essential that the communication be broad and not only ultimately go to the school, but we even have to think about going to the community. And are we setting an environment where we can disagree? The ability to disagree in a committee is critical. Somebody just mentioned diversity of thought, perspective, and viewpoints. And having that diversity is critical, but allowing for that expression, of course, is even more critical. How do we take the time to make sure that people's ideas are heard and respected? Actively model and encourage optimism. Spread a message of hope and perseverance. Now, this is not unlike the idea of the pilot project, that we're on a journey here. SEL is a journey. Changing your school culture and climate is a journey. Even changing your classroom culture and climate is a journey. And so we have to help people understand that it is a process. And like every other process, it has ups and downs. It's not linear. And we don't give up on valued things just because we hit a few roadblocks. And acting like a leader, I think the concept of leadership, which is, we could spend a lot more time on that, but I believe it's important for each and every one of us that is engaged in this work to have a leadership perspective, to recognize that by virtue of advocating for this work, you are in fact exercising leadership. And so we shouldn't shirk away from that. We certainly know from lots of data that school principals, district superintendents cannot be the ultimate agents of change. They're too busy, they get too distracted. That leadership has to come from elsewhere if social and emotional learning is going to be sustained. The principal clearly has to be in a position of support, or at the very least, non-opposition. And that's an issue that we'll talk a little bit more about later on. The last thing I would point out to you is that if you really want to help your committee grow, these dimensions that are on these couple of charts and the things that you've mentioned in the chat box, you should create a checklist that gives you your team an opportunity to monitor, self-monitor on a relatively frequent basis how we're doing. And if you go to the link, you'll see something on schools of social, emotional competence and character, where there is a checklist for some of these things. I don't think that we want that checklist to be uniform. I think each of us can decide on the 8 or 9, at most 10 things that are most important to monitor for your leadership team. But I think that's a practice that we've instituted in many, many schools in New Jersey, and we find it's extremely helpful. And if there are, questions about this, please raise them in the chat box. I want to point out that there is a special role for a district culture and climate committee. Here again, I've seen this in schools where there are multiple schools in a district implementing this, that having a district climate and culture committee that is made up of representatives of each of the schools is crucial for passing the baton. It is the vehicle for schools talking about what they're doing, talking about how they coordinate, and how to build a coherent developmental system. Most of these culture and climate committees meet monthly, and then people come back and share the product of the meeting, the notes of the meeting within their schools, and it begins to open up not only cross-school dialogue, but a lot of cross-school idea sharing. It's an odd thing, but I've been to a number of schools in districts that feel competitive with each other. Somehow they feel like if they give their good ideas to their other schools, that it will diminish what their school is doing. I understand that at some level, but where the kids are concerned, I have a hard time with it. So, it may be a norm, but it's a norm that I think we have to begin to look past in the interest of developmental science and in the interest of literally the moral development of our kids. We need them to have the best that we can possibly give, and getting it from other schools is a very important element of that. One other piece of having a leadership team is being able to have courageous leadership conversations. And I'd like to share with you 4 of the courageous leadership conversations that I have seen really move teams along. Number 1 is when folks share, what is the one ongoing practice or custom currently present in your school that you would stop doing? I think there are many things that we allow ourselves to tolerate in the school. We feel either we can't possibly change them or we don't know how to change them. And part of courageous leadership is articulating this, because once we articulate it, that's what partly gives us the courage to actually think about changing it. And here's the other dirty secret. When you mention the things that you find distasteful, more often than not, many of your colleagues find the same thing, but they haven't articulated it. Second courageous conversation, what is one SECD related practice that you're not doing in your school that you would start doing? And this is important because we have to start somewhere. And if we, as a team, can begin to identify a practice that we really think would be the best place to start, it will in fact be the best place to start. What aspect of the school culture and climate that you question would you finally want to resolve? There are a number of practices that we wonder about. Maybe we wonder about, they come up at staff meetings, we wonder about them, we talk about them in the teacher's room, we wonder about them, but then we go on. And I'm suggesting that courageous leadership involves not just going on, but going back and looking at the things that we question, ask ourselves, why are we questioning this? Let's decide we're going to keep it or we're not going to keep it. But let's not keep ourselves in this sort of middle ground here. And finally, how would you begin a conversation about the core ethical principles that you most want to define? What you do, how you do it, and how people will treat one another in the school. This is a big conversation, but these are the courageous conversations that we have to have. And honestly, I think that we hesitate to have them. When we start to have them in our team, we will find more often than not a lot of support within the team. And I'll tell you a corollary of this that I found. If you can't have these conversations within your team, then your team has to do some team building, before you actually start to take on projects. Because until you can have these conversations in your team is not going to be ready for prime time to get out there and really implement SEL in a way that's going to have a lasting and sustainable impact. So we can't be too much in a hurry. We have to also be patient with our team and allow our team to build and grow. And then when it's ready, it's going to be very hard to stop. We've seen this over the years. Okay, so again, there's a lot on these PowerPoints because after we're done with our conversation this evening, you'll still have the PowerPoint, and so I want to make sure that you've got these things to really refer to, reflect on, and most of all to share with other colleagues who might not be on. So here again, when we talk about implementation, there are some special implementation stages that are true of schools with the most difficulty. There are a lot of things that are the same, but for the past 15 years, I've been working with low-income urban districts, largely minority, very poor achieving, high poverty, high trauma, and we found that the concept of turnaround, literally taking schools that have been in a downward spiral and creating a virtuous cycle of upward movement is the goal. And so I just want to share with you these 7 principles, which you can see articulated in more detail at a link that you'll see on the next slide. Number 1 is defining success in phases. That one has to, at the very outset, have the mentality that this is going to take some doing, and it's going to be step 1, step 2, step 3, and we have to not think that we can move faster than we can move. This work of school turnaround is very hard to put on a strict timeline. If you've got a school that's hurting, and you've got a school that has a history of failure, history of violence, it takes time to move that forward, and we have to give it that time. Number 2 is that what we're doing, though, is an act of ethical and moral responsibility and educational equity. In other words, we have to light the moral flame under what we're trying to accomplish here. This is not just sort of an academic activity. It's not sort of a good thing to do. It's not best practice. It's more than that. It's the future of our kids here, and whether we are going to do ultimately what's necessary to give our kids the best chance they can have for leading an ethical, responsible life of college, career, and community service. And that's the equity angle. In a lot of schools, you may have experienced this. I've seen this. We're so focused on teaching the kids reading and math that we forget that what they need in life is not simply skills for tests, but literally skills for the tests of life. And so we want to make sure that no one sees this turnaround work as business as usual, that this is a moral enterprise here, and that's what's going to keep us going when the going gets tough. The third thing is building a leadership team, as we've talked about. But the second codicil here, allowing the team time to learn and grow together, the corollary is that very often when a leadership team in a failing school gets empowered, they're given the toughest stuff to do first. And when that happens, you get failure. A leadership team has to learn how to grow and work together, and you cannot do that on the most difficult problems. You would not teach someone to drive by putting them on the Amalfi Coast and having them drive around those hairpin curves. They would not last very long. And the same thing is true with a leadership team. You do not give them the great challenges first. They need to grow into that, and we have to understand that. Right? And number 4 is the paramount importance of creating and communicating a compelling school identity. Who are we going to be now? What is it going to mean to set foot in this building? That is what has to take place, as opposed to a failure identity, which many troubled schools have. Someone mentioned earlier the idea of growth mindset. This is a corollary of growth mindset. This is the idea that we are going to stand for something positive, and that's going to be our driving force. The fact that we have had a failure history is unfortunate, but that's the past, and we are going to move into the future with a sense of optimism. Number 5 is engaging and empowering youth in meaningful roles in the school and unjumbling the schoolhouse. We will be talking about this more in just a minute, but we have to take a meaningful look at what we're doing in the school, and we have to be prepared to make some changes. We cannot do business as usual, as Josh Garcia said in the video, and expect to see different results. And part of that means that we have to reconceptualize the role of youth in our schools, that their role in school turnaround is just as important as staff, that the kids in the school want a great school. They are willing to work for a great school. They are willing to put in extra effort for a great school. We just have to create that reality. Okay. Finally, number 6, network with others on a similar mission. So that is about the idea that we can't do this work alone, that we have to be working with others who are simultaneously doing the work or who have done the work before, and we have to learn from them and collaborate with them. We'll talk a little bit more about this later on. And then finally, connect SEL to existing mandates. SEL cannot be seen as one more thing. SEL has to be seen as something that is consonant with what we're trying to do. SEL will help us do what we need to do better. If we have to do bully prevention, SEL is part of it. We have issues of opioid abuse, drug and alcohol issues. SEL is part of that solution. For academic performance, SEL is part of that solution. It is not something off by itself. It is essential to what we most want to accomplish in our schools. A number of states are creating mandates for social and emotional learning and character development. That's a good thing, but a lot of times those mandates are not necessarily followed through with support. So we ourselves have to recognize that SEL can be a mandate, but it needs to be a mandate linked to existing mandates. SEL is what will help our school solve its other problems. It's not going to be a means in and of itself. So these are some of the things that have been particularly important implementation guidelines when it comes to working with particularly troubled schools. And a big part of that is looking at what our schools are doing already to begin the process of unjumbling the schoolhouse. So you're going to see a detailed set of slides that follow. I'm not going to go over everything in them. They come from Chapter 2 of the book Promoting Social Emotional Learning Guidelines for Educators, where we elaborate on this process. But this is where we have to take a realistic look at what we're doing, and where we have to cast a wide net so that everyone understands that we're already doing this, that we're engaged in SEL. We just have to now get it to be coordinated, better, intentional, focused. So I'm going to share an inventory with you. Again, that is in more detail in that Chapter 2. But the whole point is recognizing the strengths of what you're already doing in social, emotional, character development and prevention and wellness promotion, right? Because that's part of social, emotional, and character development, is our prevention and wellness promotion efforts. So it's not like you have your bully prevention thing over here and your culture and climate thing over here and your SEL thing over there. It's all part of one. What are our priorities going to be for innovation? What are we going to focus on? And finally, let's unjumble. What can we get rid of? What are we doing that we've been doing for a while that we don't even know why we're doing it anymore? I've been in that situation. I'll tell you a brief story about that. My colleague John Clabby and I were working in school, and we wanted to implement social decision-making problem solving, which is an evidence-based SEL program. And we approached people, and they said, well, we can't do that. And we said, well, why can't you do that? And they said, well, because of what happened to Selma Skolnick. And we asked, well, what happened to Selma Skolnick? And the people we spoke to said, we don't know what happened to Selma Skolnick, but we know it wasn't good. All right, so we started on a journey to find out what happened to Selma Skolnick that led people to think that implementing any kind of social and emotional program would be bad. To make a long story short, we eventually found someone who had been in the district for 30 years. And 25 years ago, with very few people who we talked to were around then, 25 years ago, there was a teacher named Selma Skolnick, and she did Magic Circle, which some of you may know is an old affective education program. And nobody knows exactly what happened, but they do know that Selma Skolnick did Magic Circle and got in trouble for it. That's all they knew. So here we have compounded lore that affected people's willingness to do social and emotional programming. And so that's why it's so important to be willing to look in the past, see what's happened, see what hasn't happened, and let's start to create a better present. So if you have a list of activities going on in your classrooms, schools, or district that support social, emotional, character development, prevention, and wellness promotion, it's important to have a list. What are we doing in kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, all the way up the line? So we know, right? And we're not going to argue with people about whether they're doing it or not doing it. Let's get a big list and start to go from there. It is important to find out when people say they're doing something, how often do they do it? Because if they do it, once a month, that's different than doing it once a week or twice a week. So we need to know that. And here are the kinds of things we're talking about. Are they doing positive youth development? Do they do something with diversity? Do they have some kind of bully prevention, substance abuse prevention, suicide prevention, anxiety prevention? Is there conflict resolution? Do we have support services to help kids cope with school transitions and family disruptions? So let me talk about this because this is something that may be new to some of you. In New Haven schools, James Comer, who is such a legend in the world of child development and prevention and social and emotional, they had a number of kids who suffered from terrible family disruptions. And what would happen is that these kids would have horrible things happen in their families, and then you would notice them because their grades would start to go down or their behavior problems would start to go up, and at a certain point reach a threshold where people would worry about it. And so what Comer basically found out was that when kids' parents begin a process of separation, before they even get divorced, when they're starting down that road to divorce, that's when you have to give kids support services. The time, you don't wait until the kids have experienced divorce and its difficulties. Get these kids into services right away. Comer also found in his urban schools in New Haven that he needed groups for kids whose parents were incarcerated. Because again, when parents get incarcerated, terrible thing, might not be bad for their kids immediately, but the bad things are coming. So why wait for the bad things to come? Let's support kids who are experiencing life difficulties and crises once we know about them, as opposed to after their behavior or academics have deteriorated, and then we're kind of coming back in after closing the barn door after the cows have left, So that's that idea. And what are we doing by way of service? What are our school kids' service opportunities for peer leadership, peer mediation, volunteering, mentoring. What's going on with all that in our schools? Let's get a handle on that. And to what extent, when we look at our list, do we have things going on in at each grade level, developmentally sequenced? What kind of continuity is there? We've got to ask those questions and know the right answers. What's going on in classroom instruction? Do we have any systematic social and emotional skills being taught in our classrooms? Are kids with special needs getting those programs? Because, you know, a lot of times social, emotional, and character development is going on in tier 1, but not in the other tiers. And that's a problem. Got to think about, you know, what are we doing for our kids who are not in the mainstream classroom? And how do we basically prepare our staff to deal with the social and emotional development of our kids and our own staff's social and emotional development, especially for those of you who are in a very challenging school? What kind of supports do we have for our staff to be able to deal with stress? And this is a double-edged sword, because some of you may be doing mindfulness in your schools, and I'm curious, you might want to just put in the chat box if you are at a school where staff is engaged in mindfulness. Mindfulness is a double-edged sword in the sense that it's very useful, but the reason that we have to have mindfulness is because of the stress that people are feeling. And so wouldn't it be a good strategy to think about, why do we have this stress and how do we reduce the stress that we're experiencing, as opposed to how do we get great at adapting to the stress? Right? So again, there are two sides of the coin here, and they're both important. Too much mindfulness is not a good thing, because we also have to worry about the sources of stress that we're dealing with in our schools. Right. Do we get input from parents and community members about the well-being of our kids? That's an important consideration. How do we communicate with parents about what we're doing? You know, again, that can be very challenging, but it's an issue. It's a question we have to ask, and then an explicit decision that we make about whether we want to kind of go down that road. How do we bring in new initiatives? What's the history in your school building of bringing new things in? How do they get brought in? Who's involved? How systematic is it? How much ongoing support happens for people? Do we use turnkey training? Do we have ongoing coaching? That's the question that's really being asked in this section. And how well are we aligning tier 1 and tier 2? We'll talk more about this, but one of the key issues in social and emotional and character development is the fact that when you do something in tier 1 and the kids are getting any kind of counseling and support services in tier 2, we have to make sure these things are aligned, that we're not giving kids a different model in tier 1 and in tier 2, that we're not giving them different skills in tier 1 and tier 2, that has to be aligned if we want our most troubled kids to be able to get the message and have it reinforced when they are in the mainstream environment. Okay. And finally, how do we know that we're being successful? How do we know? How do we evaluate what we're doing? That's one of the most difficult challenges I think we have, but I think there are two dimensions to this. One dimension, of course, is data. The other dimension is, let's call it common sense. I learned this too from my former mentor, Tom Schuyler. When I first was doing a very comprehensive intervention and evaluation program in his schools, we had an NIMH grant. We had all kinds of data, and I was telling him about all the measures that we were going to use. And he says to me, hey, you know, great that you have all these measures. I'll tell you how I'm going to know when the program works. I said, okay, tell me. He says, you see these? He took me to his office. He says, see these 4 chairs? I said, I see the 4 chairs. He said, when I don't need these 4 chairs outside my office, that's how I know that your program works. Now, I could have said to him, Well, you know, that's not a valid indicator. There are other ways to get those 4 chairs to disappear besides our pro. That's too rational. It's important for the people that you work with to ask that question. How are you going to know this is working? What are you looking for that's going to make you think that the program is working? Because that is extremely powerful as a motivator for people. Yes, the data need to be there, but if people aren't seeing what they need to see, the data will not sustain the program efforts. So ask the question, ask it for yourself, and then think about how to make sure that what we're doing touches on that. Again, let me give you a specific example on this. For a number of teachers, manners matter. And I think there's an empirical case to be made about the benefit of kids exercising good manners, holding doors open for someone else, picking up something when someone drops something, saying please, saying thank you. These are things that I think many people find important. I think it's safe to call them social and emotional skills. And I think it's safe to say that very few social emotional curricula deal with them. And so that's a case where if this really matters to you, whether the program you're working with or the approach you're working with deals with it directly or not, you want to make sure that you address it. Right? So that's kind of what I'm talking about. Find out what matters to people and make sure it's addressed, whether it's in the program formally or not. Make the adaptations necessary. That creates great impetus towards sustainability. Okay. So if you have any questions about this whole idea of taking an inventory of what we're doing and then stepping back, thinking about, okay, where do we need to go next? And what is it that we've been doing for such a long time that maybe we should get rid of? You know, when we have assemblies, are they really meaningful? Are they integrated into what we're doing? Are they just isolated events? That's the kind of thing we're talking about. Take a look, and before you plant any new things into your school garden, it's so important to take away stuff that people have been doing that they just would be better off not doing. Okay. So I want to move on to the area of assessment. This is a hot topic. And so in the chat box, if your school is using some kind of an SEL assessment, it would be great for you to share with us what your school might be doing. The vast majority of schools are not, but some are. Sounds like somebody uses the DESA, the DESA Mini. DESA Mini is a 8-item, very short assessment that covers SEL skills. One of the more popular things to use. Okay, so while you're sharing what you're doing, I want to share with you a distinction made by Tony Bright about assessment for research and assessment for improvement. And here's the difference. So assessment for research is when you have a standardized instrument like the DESA, and you use that as the way to evaluate whether your social, emotional, and character efforts are working. You'll find out that their DESA scores will go up or down, regardless of what it is you happen to be using. But whether or not the scores go up and down may not be an actual indicator of whether your program is working. For that, Tony Bright says you need assessment for improvement. So the distinction that he's making is that when you use a standardized instrument, like the 8 items in the DESA, for example, that's good, and it'll tell you how you're doing in SEL, and it'll tell you how your kids are doing in SEL relative to maybe other kids where they're taking the DESA. But the question is whether the DESA is tapping into what you're doing in your SEL curriculum. more often than not, the standardized assessments that we use do not reflect the curriculum we're using. Therefore, we sometimes get underestimates of results when we use the standardized instruments, and we are not able to know how to improve our program because we haven't assessed the exact SEL that we have done. So that's what I would like you to think with me about for a couple of moments. How do we go about creating an assessment that is tailored to what we are doing? And so when we get feedback from that assessment, we can directly use that feedback to modify and improve our program. And I'm going to suggest to you that the secret weapon in this work is the report card, especially the other side of the report card. I would ask you to think about the comments on your report card. Think about how those comment sections have even gotten there. In many, many schools that we work in, schools have report cards that have drop-down menus, and those drop-down menus came from places that nobody even really quite knows where they came from. And our data warehouse systems rarely give feedback on report card comments. We work with one school, a high school in New Jersey, where they have drop-down menu, had 60 choices that a teacher could choose from with regard to commenting on the student's behavior. And you can only choose 2 out of the 60. We found that in looking at multiple years of data, no one ever picked anything after number 31. So in other words, you only had 2 things to pick. You're going to pick something from among the first 30 things that you saw and never even got to the rest of the things on that list. And it's just, if it strikes you as not making any sense, that's because it doesn't make any sense. I'm suggesting that you want to think about organizing your report card in a way that emphasizes the skills and performance and character competencies that you actually want to build in your kids. So, for example, if you're following the CASEL guidelines, these would be the 5 basic areas that you would actually have represented in your report card, right? Because these would be the 5 skills that you want to be showing progress on. Now, there's a nuance to this that I will get to. Let's say that you're more oriented toward character education than you are toward SEL skill development. Well, there are a number of schools like Montclair Kimberly Academy in New Jersey where the staff have come together. They've decided on the character expectations that they have for the kids. They define them, and then they provide a rating scale for them. Now, I am not endorsing what the Montclair Kimberly Academy does. I'm simply showing you that a staff comes together. They decide what are the character virtues that they most want to see grow in their kids. They define it, and then they create a feedback system. And you'll notice that they don't only just give the ratings 1 through 5, they also have to give some evidence for why they're giving the rating. So if I rate a kid as being an exemplar with a strong conviction and character, I need to be able to put down a couple of anecdotes of things that I saw that led me to give that rating. Okay, so here again, this is not psychometrically valid, but this has tremendous validity with regard to congruence with what we're doing. So in our work in Jersey City, we focused on these character virtues with the students in middle school, our Mosaic project, Mastering Our Skills and Inspiring Character. And we assessed every one of these virtues, right? So here again, we want to tailor assessment to what we're doing so that when we find out that the kids did not become more generous, we can see what the generosity elements were in our curriculum, and we have to think about how we want to improve them. More than that, report card, by putting SEL character into your report card, you change parent-teacher conversations. You begin to identify areas of strength and areas in need of improvement that parents should know about. In fact, the parents actually may already know about them, but they haven't shared it with you. So when you have a conversation with parents about things you're seeing in the kids, and the parents don't know about it, sometimes it's because the kids show that attribute at home. They just don't show it at school. So then we're not dealing with a skill deficit. We're dealing with something else to find out what that is. And when we see an area of improvement in both school and home, then we are more confident that we're dealing with a skill area. A conversation between parents and teachers become allies in building skills, social, emotional, and character development. You know, parents care a lot about their kids' academics, but at the end of the day, if you force a parent to sit down and choose, you say to the parent, you can have a smart kid or you can have a good kid. You only have one. Which would you pick? Vast majority of parents pick the good kid. So at the end of the day, they want to have conversations about kids' character. And there are a number of parents who just cannot help their kids with math. They may not have the language skills to help the kids with reading, but they all have the capacity to help their kids with character and social emotional competence. So when you also have this assessment on the report card, you have a way of grounding your interventions, you have a way of monitoring progress over time in a naturalistic way. And this just becomes part of what teachers are doing. In the schools that we work with where they put this in, they take out the comment section. So in other words, they don't add to the task of the teachers by putting the comments and social, emotional, or character ratings. What they do is they basically take away that drop-down menu stuff and say, okay, what do we really want to rate here? What 5, 6, never more than 7 things do we want to focus on? And that's what we're going to do, right? And of course, when you have this coming in the report card, it also can change conversations between parent and child as they talk about the report card. So student-teacher conversations change because now we've got a grounded, regular way to talk about kids' social and emotional behavior. The teachers are, in essence, rating what they've seen and sharing what they've seen, and that's very valuable. The idea of being able to show kids that these are important skills, and as you grow in these skills, your academics will improve is very powerful indeed. And as I said before, you're giving kids the collaborative responsibility of improving in these skills. In other words, you know, it's ultimately the child that has to be a full collaborator in improving their social, emotional, and character development. It's not something the teacher can do for them. It's something that needs the kids' cooperation, and therefore the child will have some important responsibility in doing that. Right? So here's an example I want to share with you of what one district that we work with has done. They identified 7 skills across the main areas that they were going to focus on. Those are the skills that are in bold, and then underneath in parenthesis is the definition that they gave to each of those skills. So emotion regulation and focus means use strategies to keep oneself calm and focus on goals. So again, you may disagree with these definitions. God bless you if you disagree. The point is that a staff group got together and agreed on this and have moved forward from this in a positive way. So, so again, those are the 7 skills that they chose and how they define them. Within a week, we will have up on our website examples of this at www.secdlab.org under our district and school-wide projects tab. We will have examples of sample report card rating materials, especially like this. Now, let me show you what we have here. This is an important nuance. So, the report card needs to be developmentally sensitive. So the question that the staff grappled with, and it took a year to do this, I don't want to pretend that it happened instantly. They basically said, all right, so what does emotional awareness look like in grade 3, grade 4, and grade 5? What are we looking for? I'm a teacher, and I want to know if my kid has emotional awareness. What am I going to look for? So in grade 3, you'll notice it says it can recognize and accurately label a range of emotions, including pride, surprise, frustration, loneliness, honesty, fairness, most of the time with prompting. And they can connect feelings to situations in which they take place with prompting. And that basically means that you're not expecting the kids to spontaneously identify the emotion that they're feeling in a situation. You're prompting them. How are you feeling in this situation? And then kids begin to understand that they need to connect feelings to situations. And you'll notice that in grade 4, they can begin to recognize and accurately label emotions most of the time, not all the time, and that they can connect feelings with prompting. By grade 5, which is when now kids are getting ready to go to middle school, in some cases they even start middle school in grade 5, they need to be able to not only recognize and label these emotions most of the time, they need to be connecting emotions and situations without you prompting them. Right? This is something that we need to be seeing kids doing. And so the ratings system is either sometimes emergent, proficient, advanced, below, at, or above grade level expectations. The idea is that these definitions are the definitions of grade level expectations for these particular skills, right? So what schools do is literally go through and do this for all the grades that they actually want to have ratings. And so you have a developmental scope and sequence. In this book, which I immodestly share with you, you will see many examples of these developmental sequences. You'll see examples of what schools around the country are doing with regard to both SEL and character, and how they are able to integrate it into the report card. But the key point, though, is that it's being tailored. They are aligning it with their intervention so that they can take the results and directly use the results for feedback. When you use a standardized assessment and you get results, if SEL is low or hasn't improved as much as you would like, you have no idea what in your curriculum it is connected with. So that happens to be what you want to avoid from the point of view of being able to assess for improvement. And this resource, the other side of the report card, focuses exactly on that. Okay. Last thing I want to cover before we just open it up for questions in general is the issue of sustainability. There actually are some things that we know that when we build them into our intervention planning process, lead to more sustainability. And these considerations are critical. How do we make sure that we keep SECD from being separate, that it is connected to mandates and core academic content? How do we make sure that our staff is prepared and comfortable to do this work, that our staff have training and support? And finally, how are we connected to collaborators? So are we connected to other schools of character in Alaska? There's the emerging organization SEL for US, which is a network of state SEL affiliate organizations. I'm hoping that before very long there will be an SEL for Alaska. And the point of those state level SEL organizations is to provide regional support networks, to give you the ability of sharing your emerging work with one another so that everybody does not have to reinvent the wheel, that you can see the programming work that you're doing, that you can see the intervention work that you're doing, you can see the assessment work that you're doing. I mean, so much has already been shared in the chat box that's so valuable. Just imagine kind of institutionalizing that activity of giving folks in the SEL space a regular chance to share with one another, as well as ask questions to one another about, so what are you doing about this? How are you approaching that? And again, getting answers from your colleagues. So a number of years ago, CASEL decided to check on sustainability of intervention. So I said earlier how you could find the best interventions on both sides of the intervention ledger, and that it really is the implementation process that determines whether something succeeds or not. Well, what CASEL wanted to look at are schools and districts where SEL had been at least 3 to 5 years after the school had been recognized as having a well-established program. And the question is, when we look 3 to 5 years after a school has been recognized as functioning really well in the SEL world, it's a flagship school, whether it's a flagship for Second Step or Mind Up or whatever, we go down 5 years after that, which schools are still doing it? Which schools have sustained? And what is it about those schools that have led them to keep what they're doing? And knowing this information is helpful in the planning process, as you'll see. So I'm gonna go through it relatively quickly because of time, but active administrative support and follow-through, that definitely has to have some active and visible support by administrators, not their direct involvement. They can cheerlead and all can go well. And when you lose your cheerleader, that often is a problem, which is why you want to have multiple cheerleaders among the administration wherever you can. Intervention by program developer to engage new administrators. So if you are using a standardized SEL curriculum, Second Step, Open Circle, whatever, it is important to stay connected to the mothership. The idea that you are going to be doing this independent and somehow you have to do it on your own is a myth. When a superintendent changes, reading companies swoop in to a school and say, you know, we are going to support your school as this transition takes place so that your reading program will not lose a beat. And when they do that, they find that the new administrators then go worry about something else. In the same way, when you show that you're connected to a larger entity, it makes it harder for a new administrator to get rid of your SEL effort. Simply, I hate to say it, but if simply you and I say, well, it's a good thing, but the administrator wants to bring in something else, easy to do. But if you then have the visible presence of a larger entity, the administrators think more than twice about bringing in something new, hence sustainability. Program consultation offered to the school staff. Bring in experts from the outside, develop your own experts, but it is important to keep a connection to the outside because it makes everything more vibrant for people and people want to feel that they're part of a bigger effort. So it's important to keep the visibility up by having outside involvement. Ongoing training and professional development. Again, how do we keep refreshing our folks how do we take new people and get them into SEL? For example, I was asked by one school district that we work in to do a workshop at the beginning of every school year for 2 hours with all new staff coming into the district on SEL, which basically made sure that every single person coming into the district from outside the district knew that SEL was a priority, and then could start to talk the language that would enable them to benefit from talking to their colleagues about it when they got into the schools. Initial and continued involvement of invested role model teachers. So the idea here is that in every school where things were sustained, there were a group of teachers that really were invested in keeping the program going, in keeping it refreshed, in making sure that the newcomers got on board, in keeping the parents involved. More than anything else, invested role model teachers are a key to sustainability. And so if you are trying to cultivate this in your school, you want to think about, how can I develop that group? How can I encourage that group? How do I encourage them to have book talks? How do I encourage them to have brown bag lunches together? How do I help this process evolve? Related deep involvement of teams of teachers. Again, it is ultimately the committed teachers that keep SEL going in a school more than anything else. And a lot of times the strong involvement of a team of teachers will deter new administrators who just want to make a change from making those changes. Programs integrated into whole school scope and sequence. We've been talking about the need for these things to be developmental. And we also want to make sure that they are not out of the schedule, that they're integrated into the schedule, that everybody knows this is part of what's going on. It's visible, it's in the handbook, it's something that you see depicted when you walk in, it's on bulletin boards. In other words, social and emotional character development cannot just be, as you heard in the video, something that happens in a small part of the school day. It is something that has to become part of every school day in a pervasive way. And finally, can't do it on grants. That this needs to eventually be part of the district budget. It is not necessarily a big cost center, but it is something that the district needs to take responsibility for. It can start with a grant, but what often happens, I've seen it, you've probably seen it too, that when the grant goes, the program goes. So that's why we'd be very careful how to create our expectations and how to be looking ahead, look at the budget cycles of your schools, make sure that we're anticipating and getting the resources to keep a program going when whatever grant you might have is going to disappear. We're ahead of the game. You'll see more information about this, but there is the Academy for Social Emotional Learning in Schools that is meant to be a support for people that want to develop their SEL competencies, both in leading a school of character and social emotional competence, as well as in the process of direct instruction. You can go to the website, selinschools.org, get some more information about it. But the idea is that there are places to go to build expertise if you might not have local expertise around in your particular building or geographic area. Okay. So at this point, I am ready to take a look at questions that might be brewing and seeing if we can address those. There have been a lot of wonderful comments in the box, but if there are particular questions, this would be a good time for folks to put them in. There are a couple of final points that I would want to make before we do close up, but I do want to leave time for any questions that folks might have about some of the things that we've said or things you want to hear more about. I'm going to put up my email address and my contact information because especially as you get to go through this in more detail and read over some of the things we just touched on, if you do have questions, my email address is right on the bottom, maurice.elias@rutgers.edu. And I certainly would encourage you to be in touch. That happened after the first webinar. I was pleased to be able to be in touch with some folks about it. Let's see, question. So I see the issue about potentially not having enough folks for a leadership team. I would say that you need to keep the team concept going, but it's okay to start small. I would say before you go to the staff with anything, I would say go to 1 or 2 people with something. I have found that by starting small with folks that people can see are doing this, that is often the best way to help people both feel the courage and the capacity to move forward. So you could have a prepared curriculum. I think that's definitely a good idea as a starting point, an evidence-based SEL curriculum. Some of them are not very complicated. And but I would say get a few people, do a pilot project, and just kind of start off with no pressure. Don't even insist that people go through the curriculum systematically. Maybe people just want to try out a few things, just get the feel of it. That is again, the pilot concept is very important. Having people even read a book together as a starting point is valuable. So creating a smaller shared SEL-related experience is a perfectly acceptable and valid starting point. Glad you raised it. I assume you've had experiences with book studies, right? I mean, I hope, and well, we'll talk about this more, especially at our December workshop. But what's critical to understand is that there's not some special, extraordinary technique required to successfully carry on SEL. But a lot of people think that. People don't necessarily know that if you're a good teacher, you're already doing what's necessary to teach SEL. Any other questions? All right, so maybe Diana, I will throw it back to you.
I am here, Maurice. Thank you. As usual, lots of information and to think about and to talk about. And that's one of the things that's so valuable about taking the webinar for credit. We have the opportunity to continue these discussions, follow through, talk about challenges, talk about ways we can implement different pieces within our own environment. So we encourage you greatly to take the webinar for credit. We do just have a couple more days. Actually, November 1st is the cutoff. So if you're going to think, and we had some already enrolled this afternoon, if you're thinking of taking the webinar for credit, please get to it, because you also don't want to get too far behind in the assignments. But we thank you so much, Maurice. You could see the great interactions tonight or this afternoon, and we'll just carry those on. We've got wonderful educators across this state, and they are ready to jump in, and it's nice to have the support of those who are also doing it in their buildings, whether they're in that next stage or level or just beginning their programming, their talking, their discussions on the topic. So we thank you for all your input. Kelly, did you want to say something real quick before Maurice maybe checks out?
Kelly actually had to drop off, Diana, so.
Thanks. That's right.
Kelly's on the plane.
Forgot he was leaving at 5:15 our Alaskan time. So if you are interested in taking the webinar for credit, once you've signed up, and you'll see Melissa's going to put those websites on the chat box because they're not going to be live on the slides. So you have to sign up first, and then you can get into the online discussions. And it does take about 24 hours to get you onto the team in the on the Teaching Channel website. So don't worry. But as soon as you sign up, I'm going to send you a welcome letter, tell you all these things, what you need to do, and I'll give you also again those pieces that you need to know just for the requirements of the class and for how to get onto the website. So you're going to, if you're already in and you haven't started posting comments, you've got another week to get some things posted. You're going to sign up for the Teaching Channel using the email that you use to register for the class, and then either sign in or sign up, click on Teams at the bar and on the top of the page, and then click on our class. I know I've got some folks that are having trouble getting there, and I'm working on making sure that they've been put into that team so that we can get you participating. But then you're going to click on the learning plan, and you'll see all of the assignments. You're going to start with step 1, introducing yourself, and then go on to step 3, step 2, and then after tonight, you'll see step 3 for this second webinar. And then if you want to see again what's the requirements for the paper, and remember, by the time you've finished posting to all the discussions, your paper is practically completed, because this is an application paper we want you putting into effect the things that you're hearing and discussing. And it's not for me, it's for you, for your classroom, for your school, for your site, for your district, whatever. So you may even want to do a team paper, and all those pieces are explained. You just go into step 1 and you'll be able to see it at the bottom of the discussion. Could you move us forward, Melissa, to the next piece? This is what you're going to see once you sign in. You're not going to look for assessment capable learners. You're going to be looking down there on the left-hand side. You probably will see that at the top. Our class will be listed. This happens to be modeling the assessment capable learnings class, but ours will be right up there at the top. You can click on that and it will take you to the discussion site. Then look in that gray box on the left, and you're going to find your piece that you're going to be participating in. Okay, can you move us forward? So these are in the chat box. If you want to register for credit, you're going to have to click on that link in the chat box, not on your screen. And registration closes November 1st, and there won't be late registration, so please sign up now if you're interested. And if you've got some questions, email me, and I will get back with you with individual responses. And it's dianakirka@gci.net. The other thing, before you leave, please click on survey number 2. We want your feedback. We want to know what's working, where we could do something differently perhaps that would make this more meaningful for you. The information from those surveys goes right to Maurice and goes to the folks at Alaska Staff Development Network. We want it to be the very best that it can be, these classes for you. So we thank you for your participation. Thanks for staying on. If you're with a team tonight, that's just fine. Click on the survey, complete it as a team, and that's wonderful input, and that's what we're doing.